Welcome back to Economics. We're in Chapter 14, talking government revenue and government expenditures. If we take a step back from econ and look at it from maybe a personal finance view and ask yourself, how do you create a budget? Okay, where does your money come from? How do you know what you can spend? What happens when you run out of money? At a personal finance level, logically, your paycheck is what you got coming in. That's your revenue source. And you look from there to say, well, what bills could I afford? Whether it be rent, mortgage, whether it be food, groceries, gas, or whatnot. Now, when and if you run out of money, you have a couple of options. If you follow Dave Ramsey as a kind of personal finance guy, you say stop spending. When you run out of money, don't go into debt. The other option would be either dip into old savings or find a way to borrow to sustain your spending beyond your income. Next up, we got a parity that kind of looks at both of those situations, both at a personal finance and an economic level.
What can I do for you today?
I would like to raise my debt limit.
Excuse me?
My debt limit, I'd like to raise it.
Because the last time I checked, Mr. Smith, you were in serious debt.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Figure we should raise that limit.
Yeah, it says here you're $140,270 in debt.
Right, so I figured we should raise that limit to about $170,000. I just bought a 60-inch flat screen. Have you ever been to Australia?
No.
Leaving tomorrow, mate. You should check it out. Great parasailing.
Do you have some new income that I don't know about?
No, I'm still making about 21 grand a year.
Okay. And are you still spending $38,000 a year?
That's what it says.
So you're adding $17,000 a year in debt.
Oh, is that what it comes out to? Debt limit going up. Ding.
Have you made any cuts in your expenses?
Oh, of course, yes. My wife and I cut $380 out of our annual budget. It's $318.
Brutal. Huh. Okay, so you're adding $17,000 a year to your $140,000 in debt, and you cut $380.
Well, you say it like that, it makes it not sound like a lot.
Hey, maybe you should think about generating some new income, maybe a new job, maybe ask for that raise.
Oh, asking for that raise, I'm not comfortable. That's an awkward conversation. I've always been able to raise my debt limit.
Yeah, well, this is a little different.
Well, how?
We're in the middle of a recession, and your credit rating will plummet if you continue to go along this path.
I don't understand it.
You don't see how bad this is, do you?
I cut my budget by $380.
You're kidding? I'm sorry, Mr. Smith. We can't help you. I'm very sorry.
My wife is going to lose it.
Isn't he?
I mean, $380 is bad enough. This is going to end our marriage. We stopped talking to each other for a month. The baby was totally freaked out.
Wait. You have kids?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sign there.
All right. Our kid's a blessing. I mean, she's got plenty of time to deal with all this, right?
Absolutely.
Are we all set?
You're all set.
All right. Let's go, kiddo. We gotta meet mommy at the car store. I think this is yours.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Thanks.
So here are the numbers from that made-up scenario. This household is currently $140,000 already in debt. They're pulling in 21 grand. They're spending 38 grand. So they're adding another $16,500 in debt to their already $140,000 that they have. They did make some cuts, $385 total. It's about 1% of the total budget. Now, these numbers are older, probably 2010, 2011, and you guys are sharp. You figured out that this is kind of a parody on the U.S. federal government. At the time, the U.S. federal government was $14 trillion in debt. That's like the country credit card. Okay, they had $2.1 trillion coming in federal tax revenue, however, they had federal tax spending of $3.8 trillion. So they were adding $1.6 trillion in debt on top of the 14 we've already borrowed from the start of the country's inception. We did make some cuts. That was $38 billion, which again was about 1% of our budget. So as we move on, we're going to take a look at that source of revenue and where do we get our money to run our different levels of government. Now, we run it at a federal level, we run it at a state level, and we run it at a local level. So how does the federal and state level of government get their money from? How do they know what they can spend? Well, the answer is income taxes. We're using 2018 numbers. That's the most recent set of numbers we could find. And if you go to the 1040 tax form, the instructions for 1040 tax forms, and in the year 2018, you look at page 103, it's going to give you a pie chart that shows you essentially these numbers here. 41% of the money the U.S. federal government gets to operate or run itself comes in individual income tax. Now that's you and I paying income taxes on our own 1040 tax return. That would be income above and beyond expenses for sole proprietors, and it would be income above and beyond expenses for partnerships, right? So federal income tax, 40% of where we get our money to run our country. 28% comes through Social Security and Medicare withholdings. Half of that comes from the employee. The other half comes from the employer. So really 14% comes from us, 14% matched by your employer. So we've said this a couple of different times. You're more expensive than your hourly wage because your employer's got to match dollar for dollar Social Security and dollar for dollar your Medicare. 5% of it comes from corporate income taxes, and the other 19% comes from borrowing. So when the federal government plans out its expenditures, they do it on a 2-year or a biannual basis. And from there, they then, hope that they'll collect tax revenue. Now, the part about that is difficult, it's very much like a household that has set bills, but you're never really sure how many hours you're actually going to get to work. It's like both spouses are hourly employees, and you're not sure how many hours you're going to get from month to month, right? So I'm fairly critical of some of our government and the way they do things. This is a tough job, right? I'm going to cut them a little bit of slack for this one because it's a very tough thing to do when you got to set your bills going forward for 2 years, but you're really not sure how much revenue you're going to get. That being said, here's the breakdown of where the federal government got its money from, at least as of 2018. Now, these numbers, ebb and flow. When you have better times, right, more money is going to come out in these sets of taxes and less comes from borrowing. When you start looking at recessionary times, you're going to have a larger percentage coming in borrowing. Where does your state level of government get its money to run itself? Well, a very large part of it, 28.71% as of 2018 numbers, state income tax, right? So you pay federal income tax, you pay state income tax. At least here in Minnesota, almost 30% of the income generated by Minnesota to run itself comes from the individual income tax that is charged. Another ballpark 30% comes from something called intergovernmental revenue, meaning the federal level of government collects all of these kind of taxes. They then divvy up a portion of that pie and then send it off to each individual state. Some states are more heavily populated than others. Some states have more of a tax base, more industry to pull different revenue to run itself. Other states are a little bit lower as far as industry or population, and thus they may need a little bit more assistance from the federal level. So something called intergovernmental revenue, that's essentially the federal government chunking up some of its revenue, sending it out to each state so they can run themselves. And again, ballpark about 15% is a general sales tax. Right? So income tax, money from the federal government, and then a general sales tax is where Minnesota gets its money to operate itself. These numbers don't add up to 100%, but these are the major categories. Each individual state will maybe have a different combination of these. Not every state has a sales tax. Not every state has an income tax. They may get their sources of revenue, but again, we live in Minnesota, so let's just worry about those numbers. Here is the link on where I found this from the Minnesota Management and Budget website. And we're going to look at our local source of revenue. And again, each local municipality may break down a little differently. We're looking specifically here at Wright County. Almost 50% of the money that Wright County gets to run itself comes from property taxes. 28% is local government aid, or saying that intergovernmental revenue. So the state of Minnesota chunks up some of its tax dollars that it collects and then sends it to the local level of government to pay for its expenditures. We'll do a different video on government expenditures. And then the last, 14% or so is charges for services. So if we look at it from a picture kind of view here, and this has worked really well when we've been in class, we draw a picture of the U.S., federal income tax, Social Security, Medicare coming out of your paycheck, corporate income tax, and then borrowing. You'll notice that the numbers don't exactly match up. These are 2016 numbers, but the picture is still a good representation of it. How do we actually borrow more money than we got coming in? Well, our government sells Treasury securities. Right? We offer essentially IOUs to businesses or different governments or other countries or investment banks, and they will buy these treasuries from the U.S. government, then giving the government more money to spend because the government's already promised to spend more than it collected in taxes. U.S. government takes a chunk of this intergovernmental revenue and sends it to Minnesota, along with state income tax. Again, that's coming out of your paycheck. So state income tax, a sales tax, and then you turn around and say, well, where does our local level of government operate? Property tax, intergovernmental revenue, and charges for services. All right, we'll stop here with the government revenue source, and we'll take a look at taxes in a little bit more in depth.